And the bell ringer, of course, what did you learn about JFK? That's what we talked about yesterday. So you type the answers to Canvas chat to that. And the media activity today, the first video was about JFK's assassination. The second one was about Nixon and Watergate. We'll talk more about that later. But don't forget to submit that after we're done with here the notes if you haven't already. 10 facts and 5 interpretations for each video. But for the notes, let's look at Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was President of the United States, as you can see up there, from 1963 to 69. Obviously, that's an odd, comparatively speaking, number of years, but that's because, remember, he took over partway through Kennedy's term, so it isn't an even amount like all the rest. Even, that is, not 8 years. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson was specifically known for the Great Society. So often we remember FDR and the New Deal. The Great Society goes along with Lyndon Johnson. And Americans weren't too familiar with him. He'd been a senator from Texas. He was the opposite of Kennedy. He came from a working class background. He was a Southerner. He was more conservative. And really, he only been asked to be vice president, so that way there'd be a balance in the ticket. So Kennedy and he were opposite, so they figured they would bring two different types of voters out to vote for them. So the first time, really, they would get to know LBJ would be when he is sworn in on Air Force One. The famous picture of him, of course, there happened to be a female judge that was close, the only woman judge that has ever sworn in a president. And they were able to swear him in. And you can see Jackie Kennedy is right beside him because she wanted to show her support of him becoming the new president of the United States, despite the fact that her husband had just been killed. And he also believed in volunteering. So Kennedy had created the Peace Corps, and Lyndon Johnson had created what is called VISTA, V-I-S-T-A, which is for volunteers in service to America. And so this is basically going to do some of the same things that the Peace Corps did, but it was going to take place inside the United States. And so Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, became an incredibly popular program. Eventually, it would be morphed into something we eventually called the AmeriCorps. And he also wanted to focus on job training. That's another thing that he focused on, job training. Head Start. So if any of you attended Head Start, that's a early childhood education program. So that was started by LBJ. Head Start. And Medicare and Medicaid were both started under LBJ. Medicare and Medicaid. And often we hear those, but don't know the difference between the two. But Medicare is for the elderly. Medicaid is for those with less money. That's the difference between the two. He also helped provide more funding for education, including colleges. And he also helped create the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And also the Department of Transportation. But what was surprising about LBJ is even though he was from the South and from a segregated state, probably two of the important pieces of legislation that he signed and supported were the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act of 1964, that obviously promotes equal rights, helps end segregation. Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which would help end some of the discriminatory practices at the polls for African Americans. So, Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And he also helped push through legislation for clean air and water. Part of the reason he was able to do this is because he had a lot more experience than JFK in Congress. So that's one of the reasons why he was able to get more done, more experience in Congress. He had been in both the House and the Senate. And also what was called the Johnson treatment, which is illustrated in these pictures up here. He was probably one of our taller presidents, and he was able to use that to motivate people through intimidation, usually. So he would tower over people and lean down and talk down to them. In the middle of a meeting, if he wasn't getting his way, he would open the door to his private restroom and urinate while everybody was watching, just to make them uncomfortable. So he tried to use whatever emotional things he could do just to try to push people in a certain direction. When he was younger, a lot of the senators stayed at the same apartment building, and they had a common restroom, and he would actually go and brush his teeth 10 or 20 times in the morning. So that way he could run into each of them and learn things about them and what they did or did not like. So he was interested in trying to figure out people in order to get things done. And that's what made him so successful. But probably the reason why LBJ isn't known as one of our top 3 or 4 presidents is because of the Cold War. Specifically because of Vietnam.
No one liked Vietnam?
I don't want to say no one liked Vietnam, but in fact, the war was popular when it first started. It's just that it dragged on for so long that started to change. And it ended up taking away a lot of LBJ's focus. So instead of concentrating on all those programs to help end poverty and increase education, he started to focus more and more on the Vietnam War, which ended up stressing him out. You could see just over 6 years, he aged incredibly. And in fact, he decided not to run for a second term. He could have, because he only served for a little bit of JFK's, but he decided not to. It was probably best because he died just a short while after he ended his time in office. Yes.
Now he's with JFK.
That's right.
Once again.
So tomorrow we'll talk about Nixon and more about Watergate. We have a whole unit on Vietnam, so we won't continue with that right now. For the remaining time of the period, make sure that you get that media document turned in, or the reading if you haven't got that turned in yet. And of course, there's the notifications I sent if you didn't complete any of the assignments from unit number 7. So make sure that you're working on those for the remainders of the period to get as much done as possible.